another way of hybrid. We are in the classroom presenting to our members here, and then we're happy to have you as well presenting to the world at large. So thank you, Miriam. I want to take a minute to talk about Miriam Davidson and her book. She's here to talk about The Beloved Border and by U of A Press. And she's a Tucson-based writer whose work focuses on border issues. So award-winning journalism has appeared in the New York Times, AARP Bulletin, the Arizona Republic, The Nation, The Progressive, and many other outlets. And she's author of 2 previous University of Arizona books, Convictions of the Heart and Lives on the Line. Hope I got that.
Yes, thank you very much.
Of course, we want to hold up the book right now, Beloved Border, and it's fresh out from University of Arizona Press. And U of A Press is also giving all members a discount on purchases off their catalog. And Christina will put that discount code in the chat for everybody participating outside. And for those of you in the room, we emailed it to you for your class, but we can always send it to you again. And Miriam, I'll let you take it away from here, but thank you so much.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Without further ado, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for attending and everybody on Zoom. I want to welcome everybody here and say it's a great honor to be here and to be in person. I'm glad everybody's healthy and staying safe. My plan for this hour is to show the color slides of all the artwork in my book. Well, I talk about the book, but also the process of writing it. It took about 4 years from start to finish. It's a collection of interwoven essays on current border issues. It's based on original reporting as well as on other primary and secondary sources. It's a kind of a hybrid of reporting, history, memoir, literature, political and social science. And then I also try to get at the underlying legal and moral questions that are raised by the issues on the border and to talk about some broad solutions. I wrote it in hopes of prompting a deeper discussion about what's going on the border. And so we can look to real solutions. And I'll talk for about an hour and then we'll have about a half hour for discussions and questions. Okay, this is the cover image of the book. It's a fantastic photograph of an artwork of a cross-border picnic that was done by a French artist named JR. And he's he does these kind of, I just want to talk a little bit about it because was really a great image and a great symbol for a lot of the themes that are in my book. JR works collaboratively with people on both sides of the border. And this was done in Tecate, California in 2017. And what he does is he makes these, it's like a tabletop here. He does these trompe-l'oeil things where it looks like 2 eyes and then there are people, oops, sorry. I'm back here. And then there are people having a picnic. This is the US side and then this is the Mexican side and this is the border wall in between. Okay, so the U of A Press found this image for me and I was really grateful because it's really beautiful. And they got all the clearances, which wasn't easy to do because he's in France and everything. So he was working on this while he did an artwork that's also shown later in the book. And it works on many levels. It's an example and a symbol of cross-border interaction and cooperation to create a work of art. Sorry, did I do that?
I'm not sure.
Thank you. And it's also a comment on all the surveillance that exists on the border. Part of the culture of surveillance, there's a professor in the Honors College named Victor Breitberg who teaches a class called The Culture of Surveillance. And I went to the border with him. We did a tour with some of his students of Nogales in 2018. It's described in the book. And also the symbolism of the eyes watching us, watching the border, because the photo was taken from a surveillance drone. And it also is symbolic of the border as a face that's cut in two, like a body, part of a body and a mind divided. It's an arresting image, as a friend of mine said. And as a cover, it looks out at you as a reader and makes you look twice.
the down arrow.
Okay. The true border, a true place of encounter, is by nature permeable. It is not like medieval armor, but rather like skin. Our skin does set a limit to where our body begins and where it ends. But if we ever close up our skin, we die. And I chose this quote as an epigraph from my book, as the lead-in quote for the book. Justo Gonzalez, he's a very well-known Protestant theologian. And he came here and did some talks about the border. And this was one of the things he said. But I really like this image of the border as opposed to a metaphor of open or closed, which doesn't really fit for the interaction and the dynamic that goes on there. I think it's like a different sort of a metaphor of the border for a different way of conceptualizing it. It presents the border as a body, like the cover art, which needs to be both open and closed, like skin, connected, but also separate, a place where there's a free exchange and passage of goods and ideas and people, yet also where there is safety and security and the rights and dignity of all are upheld. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to, there. Okay. Okay, this photograph was taken in around the time that Trump was elected on a promise to build the wall. And it was Trump's election that really prompted me to decide I need to go down there and write about what's going on the border, because there already was a lot of walls on the border. And people, I think, far away don't really understand the dynamic of what actually is happening on the ground on the border. So in the beginning of 2017, that's when I decided I should go out and find out what's going on and write some essays about the border. This is actually my third book about border issues, but it's been 20 years since I wrote my last one. I married late in life and had some kids. And so now I'm the mother of a couple of teenagers. So that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. But when back in the 1980s, when I first moved to Tucson, I covered the trial of sanctuary workers and for the Christian Science Monitor and the Religion News Service in the 80s. And then I wrote my first book in 1988 about the sanctuary movement. And then in 2000, I wrote my second book, Lives on the Line. Both of them were published by the U of A Press. And that looks at Nogales as a microcosm of the border, where I looked at different border issues through what was happening in Nogales. Okay, and then I had this 20-year period where I had faced a lot of rejection and failure as a writer. And that was really important to me. That was really important to my process because as all writers know, there's a lot of rejection, a lot of failure. When you want to go out there and write something, you have to be willing to accept that it's going to be a tough road. So in 2017, I started a blog on WordPress. It's called notetotrump.com. And I researched and wrote a series of essays, mostly but not all, on border issues. And I posted them on this blog that nobody read except some Russian trolls. And I don't usually write fiction, but one of the essays I wrote was a fable called The Emperor's New Wall, because I wanted to write this image. Trump said the wall doesn't exist, but I wanted people to know that the wall existed, but people couldn't see it. So I wrote this fable once upon a time. And then I was not going to include that in the book, but then I happened to be looking at Silent Spring, if you all know that book, which also begins with a fable, and about what the world would be like if the birds stopped singing. And so my editor at the U of A Press, she said, well, why don't you rewrite the fable so it's less specifically about Trump and the wall, but more about what's happened on the border over the last, however many years. So I rewrote it, and it now starts my book. And then the book, as I said, goes into these essays about current border issues. One of the issues that I wrote about in my blog was murders of reporters in Mexico. In 2017, it was like I was getting emails every day about another reporter being murdered. One of them was called Miroslava Breach. She was shot down in front of her son while she was taking him to school in Chihuahua City. And then a couple months later, Javier Valdez, a noted reporter in Culiacan, was also murdered. And then something happened that really galvanized my desire to turn this into a book. This is a quote from my friend Yolanda that prompted me to write the book and to dedicate it to her. And I'm going to read, this is how the book opens after the fable. My Mexican friend Yolanda, who I've known for more than 20 years, called from her home in Nogales, Sonora, just before Christmas 2017. In a trembling voice, she said that her younger brother, Filiberto, who was in his early 60s, had been beaten nearly to death by his stepson and members of the stepson's gang. Filiberto owned a house in Puerto Penasco, Rocky Point, a seacoast town at the top of the Gulf of California, that the gang had been using to stash and sell drugs. Yoli said the gang had left the house when Filiberto showed up, and even though he hadn't thrown them out and there was no fight, they came back later that night and attacked him. They broke all his ribs and damaged his internal organs. She said he lay in the house for a week until another family member, a niece, I think, went to check on him and found him there. She took him to a hospital, but after a day or two saying there was nothing they could do, the hospital discharged him. When Yoli called me, he was at their sister's house in Mexicali. She called back 3 days later to say he was dead. I sent a couple $100 to contribute to the cost of having his body prepared and returned for burial to Bacobampo, the farming village in southern Sonora, where he and Yolanda were born and raised. It was difficult to imagine the sleepy village, the site of drug shootouts, but all of Mexico has fallen under the grip of this demonic terror. Filiberto's murder was just one more in the record year of 2017, when, among other cases, a location scout for Netflix's Narcos was found shot to death in his car in a remote region in Mexico State in September, and a vacation in California city official was shot and killed in a hotel parking lot in the Pacific resort town of Ixtapa, Guerrero on December 28th. The official murder count at year end topped 31,000, some 4,000 more than in 2011, which had previously been the worst year since the military-led crackdown on drug traffickers began in 2006. But Filiberto's murder, like so many others, wouldn't even be counted among the total. He didn't want anyone to say anything, even after his death, because Yolanda said, if you report it, they come and kill your family. Oh, Yoli, I said, it must be hard for people to say brave. It's not worth it to be brave anymore, she said. No vale la pena. The cemeteries are full of brave ones. Okay, so her words inspired me to write this book and to dedicate it to her. The stories that this book concludes are meant to show how the border is on the front lines of some of the toughest issues of our time: migration, drug use, gun violence, police brutality, corruption, environmental destruction, but also that it's a place of great natural beauty and biodiversity, full of positive human energy and hope for the future. Okay, this is the one photo that is not in the book. It's in my previous book, but I wanted to show a historical picture of what Nogales looked like before the wall. And this was actually taken in 1993. It looks like 1893, but it was just before they started building this massive wall on the western side of Nogales. So I had this collection of essays, and then to turn them into a book, I needed to write this historical chapter that was going to tie all these themes that I talk about later in the book together. So I cover a lot of border history in this chapter called Prohibition Then and Now. And this Prohibition Then and Now chapter begins with a funny story about alcohol prohibition that I found in the Nogales International. And the book draws historical parallels between alcohol and drug prohibition and between the violence on the border and in Chicago during Prohibition. So I will just quickly read this little intro. With its steep hills, deep arroyos, and temperate rocky caves, the land around Nogales has always been good country for smugglers. During Prohibition, from 1920 to 1933, bootleggers operated stills throughout the mountains, both north and south of the line. Strings of donkeys trod narrow paths carrying tequila, whiskey, and other spirits to places where men waited in trucks to drive the booze to Tucson, Phoenix, and points beyond. One story is told about a rancher who got into the act with 4 pack mules he kept stabled on the east side of the Tumacacori Mountains, about 18 miles north of the border. When darkness fell, he put empty saddles on the mules and led them on his horse into Peck Canyon. The trail went west across a couple neighboring ranches, across the north slopes of the Atacosta Mountains, past Yank Spring, and then down through Sycamore Canyon into Mexico. The journey took all night. The next day, the mules rested and ate a bunch of hay, and at dusk, they were loaded with hooch and turned loose. They made a beeline back to Tumacacri, while the rancher went home by another route. The self-directing mules consistently arrived at the ranch well before daylight, ready to be unloaded. Customs agents were alerted and staked out a narrow part of Peck Canyon. Several days later, the liquor-laden mules came by and the agents caught them, confiscated the booze, and put the mules in government corrals in Nogales. The rancher showed up, claimed the mules were stolen, and since there was no proof he was involved, he got them back. This went on for 2 years. Finally, the revenuers set him up. They followed the loaded mules to the ranch, and alarmed by barking dogs, the rancher ran right into more agents approaching from the other side. He was arrested and fined, and the mules were sold off to a miner who used them to haul ore. So this was what was going on in Nogales during Prohibition. So this chapter, this historical chapter that called Prohibition Then and Now, sets up the conflicts over migration, land, smuggling, indigenous rights that occur later in the book. It describes the history of the prohibition of migrants on the border, which began with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Prior to 1882, the border was pretty much wide open, but Chinese migrants to California in the 1850s were subject to a lot of prejudice. And they were, in fact, the first group that was officially banned from the United States, Chinese migrants. Also, there was a lot of massacres of Indians that was going on the border. The Mexicans and the Americans basically joined together to massacre Yaquis and other Indian tribes that were still active on the Arizona border. And I'm sure many of you know that Arizona was the last state to join the Union because of this ongoing battles with Indians prior to Hawaii and Alaska, of course. Okay, so Mexican migrants during the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, were basically, the border was open to them. They were invited into the United States. They were recruited to, and Mexico was underpopulated for a long time after the revolution. The revolution was very brutal in Mexico. A lot of people were killed. So they would go down and recruit workers, and there would be like sending communities between different agriculture areas in the United States. And the border was, crossing the border was a civil violation. It wasn't a legal, a criminal violation until, I guess, the 1950s, it was made a criminal violation, but it was still very rarely enforced until 1986. So anyway, this photograph was taken 1993, before, as I said, just before they built the current wall, and makes me feel very old to look at it. But 1993 is ancient history on the border. But things really changed on the border starting in the mid 80s. There were periodic, as I said, Mexican migrants were invited into the United States. There were periodic periods of deportations and roundups like Operation Wetback, which took place during the 50s. And, after people came back from World War II, after the men came back from World War II, there was one. And the famous Woody Guthrie song, Deportee, was written after a plane crash in 1948 of 20 or so migrant, or I don't know, it was maybe 30, 35 migrants were killed in that plane crash in California in the late 40s. And I'm sure you all know that song. Okay, so then in the 1960s, with the Nixon declared a war on drugs, there was increasing crackdown on the border, and but it was still not too hard to sneak through the fence in Nogales in the 1980s. When I wrote the book about the sanctuary movement, the main danger was street kids armed with knives, preventing you from going through holes in the fence. So as late as the 1980s, it was pretty easy to get through in town. Okay, so then by the 1990s, the crackdown was underway. Okay. Okay, so this photo was taken probably in 2015 or so, but the big turning point in terms of the border was the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. And that was the last major immigration law that's been passed in the United States. And basically it offered amnesty to about a couple million people. This was under the Reagan era, in exchange for no more undocumented people crossing the border. The plan was the border was going to be closed off to undocumented people. And that's when they started building, the sealing off. The first places to be closed off were the areas around Tijuana and El Paso, because those are the traditional crossing spots for people because they're going to jobs in California and Texas. So those areas were closed off, and then the crackdown moved to Nogales and to other border areas. And if anybody's been down to the border now, they know that the fences go way out of town. And what's happened is that the migrants have been driven into these rural areas, like in the Rio Grande Valley, crossing the river, or also out into the desert. The migrants were basically driven out into the desert. Now the arrests, the issue of how many people are actually crossing the border has always been kind of in dispute, because up until the mid 2000s, they weren't collecting biometric data on people. So people could be the same person caught multiple times, and that would count as an apprehension each time. And that's what's going on currently too, because of the pandemic. They have started immediately expelling people without bringing them into this system called Operation Streamline, which they were, all migrants were being brought to the courthouse and given a court hearing and convicted of crimes, basically. In 2005, they started this program. In addition to the walls and other things, they started this program called Operation Streamline, which is designed to give migrants criminal records so they can be permanently excluded from the United States. And the idea was that the fencing would cut down on migration, that giving people criminal records would cut down on migration. But it hasn't really worked, because migrants are fleeing, but migrants are compelled to come here. They will risk their lives, as we've seen, to do that. So the idea was prevention by deterrence was the name of the policy, that we would just make it so hard for migrants to come here that they would give up. And so we repeatedly arrest them and deport them and arrest them and deport them. So the arrests peaked in the year 2000 at 1.6 million. And that was highest until this year, when it's over 1.7. But I understand at least that many of these people are repeat crossers. And also the population of who is a migrant really varies. It used to be everyone was a Mexican worker, but then there were Central American families. And now we're increasingly seeing people from Cuba and Venezuela, people from South America, people who are fleeing various right-wing regimes, left-wing regimes. But up until the early part of the 21st century, migrants were overwhelmingly Mexican workers. So the population has really changed in recent years. Okay. Okay, this is what the wall and the surveillance tower looks like in Nogales now. After 9/11, during the Bush administration, as I said, the crackdown on the border began under Clinton and under Bush after 9/11, even though none of the 9/11 terrorists came through the border. They mostly came through Canada. It resulted in much greater crackdown on the Mexican border. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, which was blamed for failing to stop the 9/11 terrorists, was broken up. And ICE was created, and CBP, the Customs and Border Protection. And this law was passed called the Secure Fence Act, which waived environmental laws and cultural protection laws on the border. And it's caused a lot of controversy now with environmentalists and Native Americans because the walls are now going up in very sensitive environmental areas. They've moved there's now more than 750 miles of walls on the border. And they got these urban areas pretty much sealed off. So now they're putting walls out in remote bird sanctuaries and wildlife refuges. And this has been very, very controversial, as you can imagine, because there's not a lot of people out there. Okay, so another thing that happened, as I said, Operation Streamline got started in 2005. The idea was to give migrants criminal records. And this went on, Operation Streamline went on until the pandemic has been temporarily suspended. But in Texas, they have attempted their own state Operation Streamline called Operation Lone Star. And there's been controversy over that I'll talk about a little bit later on in the talk. Okay, so under Obama, this deportations peaked at over 400,000 in 2013. And that gave rise to this new sanctuary movement that I talk about in the book, that people who were in the original sanctuary movement. These were people who were fleeing wars and death squads in Central America. And there was a trial in the 1980s of priests and nuns and others who were helping them flee persecution. And they were arguing that we have a legal right to seek asylum in the United States under the Geneva Conventions and other laws. And the US government argued that they are illegal aliens who are not entitled to asylum. And the US government did win that trial decisively. All the sanctuary workers were convicted. The US government proved that you can't set up your own immigration service. The sanctuary workers were saying, we are upholding laws that the US government is breaking. But the US government said, we get to decide who's a refugee and who's a illegal alien. So the sanctuary workers were all convicted, but those people were just, big cases for asylum, for political asylum. And with the new sanctuary movement, what you found was these were people who had long-term people who'd lived in the United States, they had children here, they were, they had jobs, and they were being picked up because of traffic stop or something like that. And because during the 1990s, there got much more integration between local police computers and the feds. So they could identify who was undocumented and who wasn't much more easily than in the past. So there were, as I said, over 400,000 people who were, not excluded. These were people who were found in the interior of the United States and deported. And that led to people saying, well, these people need protection too. Some of them were pillars of the community. Some of them have served in the US Armed Forces. Some of them are, there's, as we know, there's undocumented people who are embedded in the society all around us now. So, the new sanctuary movement came about as a result of people feeling like these people should be protected too. So there's a church here, Southside Presbyterian, where people went into the church and hid, and in other churches in other parts of the country. But sanctuary very quickly became a conflict it used to be between churches and individuals providing sanctuary, but it very quickly became a conflict between local governments and local police forces and the feds. Because the local governments and the local police forces were saying, if we have to enforce immigration law, people will not be telling us about crimes. Criminals people who are undocumented won't be turning to the local police. So it's become a conflict between state and local authority, or federal and local authority to a very large degree. What's going on with sanctuary? So I described that in the book, that California is a sanctuary state, Texas is an anti-sanctuary state. There's a lot of stuff going on right now that's over that very issue. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. Now, this is a poster that they show to migrants at this place called the Kino Border Initiative in Nogales. And I visited, and I'm going to just quickly describe there's some volunteers there who work with the migrants. So this was the description of a visit that I made in 2018. A volunteer named Rick usually worked cashing checks for people who'd been in US detention. Migrants who had money were given it back in check form when they were released. No More Desks maintained a bank account to help them avoid check cashing fees. That day, he found himself talking to a Honduran teenager who wanted to know about where and how to enter the United States. Rick showed him a map of the region west of Nogales made by Humane Borders that had lines drawn in half circles indicating distances in terms of days walking, as well as blue triangles marking water stations and red dots marking where bodies had been found. Some areas were just seas of red. The map said at the bottom in Spanish, "Don't go, there's not enough water, it's not worth it. No vale la pena." "You could die in the desert," Rick said. "Podrías morir. If I go back to Honduras, I die. If I stay here, I die. I might as well try," the boy said. Okay. So there's been an estimated 10,000 migrant deaths on the US-Mexico border in the last 20 years. About 7,000 of these bodies have been found. About 7,000 have been identified. 3,000 remain desconocidos, unknown. The book tells about some of these people who've died, and then it talks about the work of these groups like Samaritans, Humane Borders, No More Deaths. They go out into the desert and try to help people. The Colibri Center works with the bodies of the dead and to identify the bodies of the dead and return them to their families. And they have found that there's many, many families out there that will never find out what happened to their loved one because, the body will never be found. So in addition to working with the bodies of the dead, they work with the family members of the unknown and the disappeared. And these groups are very active, not only in Arizona, but in California. The brother of Duncan Hunter, Republican congressman, his brother's a doctor, and he and his wife have been very active in putting water in the desert. And also in Brooks County, Texas, they've dug up there's a checkpoint 70 miles north of the border in Texas, and they found many bodies of people trying to circumvent the checkpoint. They've dug up at least 70 bodies that were buried surreptitiously by local officials. So in Texas as well, there's work trying to take care of these people and their families. And this is work that transcends politics. It really does. Sorry. Okay, this is a screenshot of Border Patrol agent kicking over water, and this was pretty controversial when it was released. I'm just gonna describe it as I describe it in my book. In January of 2018, No More Deaths released a series of video clips of Border Patrol agents dumping water and other supplies left for migrants in the desert. The first clip, taken from a hidden camera, shows a woman agent walking down a trail between two male agents and enthusiastically kicking over 5 full water jugs as she passes by. The male agents don't join in, but they don't stop her either. The next clip, also taken by a hidden camera, a male agent looks into a plastic bag containing clothes and blankets before carrying it away like the Grinch who stole Christmas. In the third clip, the agent knows he's on camera and he's belligerent. He pours out gallon after gallon of water while he taunts and threatens the No More Deaths volunteer filming him. "Picking up this trash someone left on the trail," he says. "It's not yours, is it?" He accuses the aid worker of helping felons enter the country. The clips go on for several minutes. In addition to scenes of agents directly destroying food and water, they show aid workers finding dozens of water jugs smashed and slashed and cans of beans dumped out right after seeing border agents in the area. Okay, now this has been quite controversial, this issue of leaving food and water in the desert for migrants. And it's been going on since 2005 was the first felony arrests of people for doing this. No more desk volunteers were arrested for harboring, transporting, and those charges were dismissed. But more than a dozen have been arrested over the last 10 years for things like littering, trespassing, driving in a restricted area. The day that this video was released, the Border Patrol arrested a man named Scott Warren for helping migrants in Ajo, and he went on trial, and he was acquitted, which was while he was on trial, he spoke very eloquently about the number of bodies that have been finding people dead in the desert. And I believe he used a religious defense, that the humanitarian aid workers have been saying that this is their religious duty to try to save lives. But the government has been saying that, what they're doing is a crime. Okay, but however, this legal tide may possibly be turning, because there was four of the people who were arrested with Warren in a previous episode were acquitted by this judge, Rosemont Mine. And in her ruling, she said, the government seems to claim a compelling interest in preventing the defendants from interfering with a border enforcement strategy of deterrence by death. So the judge said flat out that this is a policy of deterrence by death. Okay. And then here we have sorry. Okay, this photograph is taken by a friend of mine when the Central American migrant families started arriving in the spring of 2018. This was during the Trump administration when they instituted the family separation policy, that if migrants' families crossed the border, the parents would be separated from the children because the parents would be put through Operation Streamline. And this was briefly in effect from, I think, April to June of 2018. And I just happened to be in the courtroom when one of the separated parents came through, and I describe it in my book. And he was asking, where's my kid? Where's my kid? And the judge was like, I will order that you be reunited with your kid, but he had no power to enforce those orders. So that policy was ended. And I'm sure you all know there's been a lot of attempt to reconnect these people or pay them a bunch of money. But basically, this was a policy that was extremely draconian, even more so than the usual what happens to people on the border. But anyway, there's still a lot of suffering going on, even though that policy has ended. Okay, a lot of the kids that were taken to a place called the Casa Estrella del Norte. It's a shelter on Drachman in Maine. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It used to be like a college place or something like that. It's right where Drachman ends. And that is now a shelter for unaccompanied minors. It's run by a company called Southwest Key. And in there are minor children. Most of them were teenagers, but for a brief period in 2018, there were children as young as 2 or 3 being sent to the shelter without their parents. And I describe an incident where one of the workers there, he was ordered by his boss to tell these 3 Brazilian siblings that they weren't allowed to hug. He was the only person who spoke Portuguese at the shelter, and they'd been separated from their mother the day before. And they were like, 14, 10, and 8 or something like that. And because they're Brazilian, they were hugging, and he was ordered by his boss to tell them there's a no-touch policy, and he refused to do it, and so he was fired. So anyway, that was one of that was one his, and then he went on TV in Brazil, and he said he was all over the world. This was in the summer of 2018. So that was what helped end that policy. Okay, so this, I also the chapter goes on and looks at the treatment of migrants in detention, and also this increasing controversy over enforcing local jurisdictions, enforcing ICE policies. We've had controversy in California over the California sanctuary. We've had controversy in Arizona over SB 1070. Arizona passed a law that required police to inquire about people's legal status. And the Supreme Court actually said that the state does not have the authority to enforce immigration law. So it cuts both ways. The feds saying, this is our authority alone. Because if the state tries to be tougher than the feds will say, sorry, it was not your purview to decide. And if the state tries to be more lenient, the feds are saying, sorry, that's our, we decide. So that was a conflict over sanctuary, and that's the conflict that continues to this day. The state, from what I understand from legal experts, it's a conflict between the sovereignty clause, which gives the federal government total authority over immigration, and the 10th Amendment, which gives the states all the duty to protect its residents from harm. It doesn't say anything about citizens or anything like that. Just the state has the duty and the responsibility to protect its people. So that's what this legal conflict is over. And as I said, it's still very much ongoing. Okay. All right. Let me hurry up here a little bit. Okay, this is the Kino Border Initiative Comedor that I visited. These are migrants that are waiting out front to get something to eat. This is right across the Mariposa port of entry, right across from you can just walk up to the border from there in Nogales. And then right across the street, they built a brand new migrant shelter, the Kino Border Initiative. And they've received funding from Michael Bidwell and the Cardinals Charities and a lot of mainstream funders in order to build a shelter for the migrants in Mexico. So this is currently, I'm sure you all are aware, there's still many migrants arriving on the border each day. Most of them are sent immediately back across. A few of them, if they can show that they have good cases for asylum, are being let in. They're being cared for by a place like Casa Alitas here. I understand that they're all being vaccinated, and there are maybe 100 people a day now coming into the Casa Alitas shelter. However, the situation on the border is constantly fluid, and I hear that the Remain in Mexico policy has been reinstituted. There's been many instances of migrants being extorted and killed in Mexico, and also the priests and the shelter workers that have been helping them, because migration is now as valuable to the cartels as drugs are. So there's a lot of the violence that's occurring is over migrants now, and not just drugs. Okay, so as I said, there's thousands being expelled in Mexico and that are in Mexico right now. Human Rights First did a report saying that 7,000 migrants have been extorted or assaulted. And then we had the incident with the Haitians earlier this year. I'm sure you all saw that. Okay, now I'm at the last third of the book. It's about environmental issues and also positive things. And this is El Jefe. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a jaguar that was photographed in Santa Rita's. I'm just going to read a little description of the video that captured El Jefe. The video's opening shot shows the jaguar walking right by the camera at night, ghostly and surreal. He glances to the side, and for a moment, his eyes shine bright yellow, as if from an inner fire that also radiates white from his cheeks and neck and undercarriage. His ears are cocked forward, his stride purposeful but unhurried. His paws look big and brown and almost clownish, like he's wearing dirty leopard print slippers. His movements convey stealth, yet a complete lack of fear. After a few seconds, he pads away, the dark rosettes on his spotted tan coat shimmering in the dark. Then the scene changes to daytime, and the jaguar is caught twice more, first by one camera as he strolls down a forest trail in dappled sunlight, and then by another on a cloudy day as he steps over a shallow rocky pool and saunters off into the distance. In all, he's shown for about 41 seconds. This video of a jaguar nicknamed El Jefe, the boss, roaming the Santa Rita Mountains near Tucson between 2012 and 2015 caused a sensation when it was released in February 2016. It went viral, quickly garnering millions of views. The images received worldwide news coverage, not only because they revealed El Jefe's magnificent self, but because they proved jaguars were coming from Mexico as far north as 60 miles into the United States. So this chapter goes on to talk about the controversy not only over the border wall, but also over the Rosemont Mine, which is going to be built in the Santa Rita Mountains where El Jefe was photographed. And there's been many major battles, legal battles between environmentalists and this Canadian mining company that wants to build Rosemont that are ongoing. The courts have gone back and forth on whether Rosemont should be built or not. There were some key permits that were granted, but then right before the construction was about to begin last year or 2 years ago, it was stopped. And so everything continues to be, and now Rosemont Copper says they're going to develop the east side of the Santa Ritas or develop the west side of the Santa Rita. So it would be visible from Green Valley. Now they're saying they're going to do that. But I think what they're doing is saying, oh, well, we won't do that, but we are going to do this. We are going to do, because they've invested a lot in this plan to build this mine. So this has been a huge environmental controversy. Also, the construction of the wall the extension of the wall into areas where jaguars cross. There's about 60, 70 miles of border that's still completely unfenced. And these are very, very rugged areas in the Patagonia Mountains. But they have been extending the fence into areas where jaguars cross and other animals cross, like in the San Bernardino Wildlife Refuge outside of Douglas. And the fence construction was stopped when Biden took office. However, I think what local people want is even local people who support the Border Patrol were upset by some of the construction that was going on here, because some of these contractors were Trump contributors. This place, Fisher Sand and Gravel, that was building this fence down near Sassabee. And these fences require complicated engineering because in Nogales, the land is hilly, there's a lot of water and running. And so the fences that have been built improperly have been knocked down. They've caused environmental damage. There's this group called We Build the Wall that's financed by Steve Bannon, or he was raising money for it. And they built this 5-mile section of wall in Texas that is apparently 30 feet from the Rio Grande. And the U.S. Attorney for South Texas, who was appointed by Trump, has sued along with the other local landowners, saying they didn't do any engineering beyond a PowerPoint slide. So there's a lot of controversy over these walls, whether they should be dismantled, whether they should be somehow fixed so they aren't going to be so damaging. But the ones in the San Bernardino Wildlife Refuge, I believe that people are going to demand that those be taken down. So that's what's going on with the walls. Okay, and then this is at the very end of the book. This is the other artwork by this guy, JR, that I was telling you about. This is a 60-foot tall poster of a little boy who lives in this villa this is Tecate, Mexico, overlooking Tecate, California, which isn't really, I don't think there is a town on the US side. It's just maybe a border crossing. So he's made of poster board and he's 60 feet tall and he's looking over the border wall. And this was done in September of 2017. It existed there for about a month. And you can see here's a Border Patrol vehicle in front of it. So this is symbolic of the kinds of art projects that are going on the border and the positive and joyful things that people are doing. And my book describes other binational art, music, environmental and health, food, social projects like the St. Andrew's Clinic in Nogales and art projects in Bisbee, and social projects on the border. Also some cross-border environmental things. Gary Nabhan, a professor at the U of A, he's working with environmentalists in Mexico on solar voltaic cooperatives where there would be solar panels that people, the people could use to generate energy and electricity and raise foods and crops and stuff like that. The chapter that was on that was excerpted in the Tucson Weekly, the chapter in my book that's on that. He's also working with Seri Indians and others in Mexico on these kinds of projects. I also, in the book, I describe a visit by Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who was one of the lunch counter protesters who protested with Dr. Martin Luther King. He was probably in his mid-80s when he was here a couple years ago. And he came to talk about Kingian nonviolence, border justice, and immigrant rights. And the panel that was with him described the ways that they are using principles of nonviolent social action on the border, and their work with refugees, and their work with the Border Patrol, and their work with all the players who are on the border. Then the book ends with an epilogue that has some solutions that are proposed by activists and politicians. Ruben Gallego is a congressman in Phoenix who's been working on the issue of ending the flow of guns to Mexico. This is a really important aspect of ending the violence in Mexico. Not only the illegal flow of guns across the border, which is highly unchecked, but also the purchase of guns by Mexican authorities that have been subsequently found to be used in atrocities. In my book, I reference both the Fast and Furious scandal, in which the ATF was intentionally selling guns to Mexican straw buyers. And that led to the death of a Border Patrol agent in 2010, Brian Terry. And as well as US weapons were found to be used in the disappearance of the 43 students in Guerrero in 2014. The Iguala police force, the police force that was implicated in their disappearance, had rifles from the Colt manufacturing company. So US weapons are being used in these atrocities in Mexico. So I end the book not only talking about what, people who are working about these issues, but also positive ways to address the causes of migration, to reduce violence and corruption and create jobs and opportunities where people want to live, which is in their homes. The president of Mexico has proposed tree planting projects and eco-tourism projects. And these are controversial for environmental reasons, but I think we really need to talk about developing, reducing violence in these people's homes and developing economic opportunities for them. And there's a lot of people-to-people projects going on that I describe in the book. One of them is the Rotary Club of Tucson has an eco filters project where they're working to provide clean water in Guatemala, and also a group called Guamap here, which also works with health promotores in Guatemala to increase healthcare there. And these are very small scale, little projects, but I wanted to include them to show that there are things that people can do. Okay. And I guess I will close by reading the last paragraph of my book. Because some of the most difficult problems of our time are presented on the border, but the solutions are there too. Border people are working on these solutions. By healing the wounds of the border, we will heal our own. Now I'll read how my book ends. The work that these and other border people are doing is the work of love and action of building Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community, as described by Bernard Lafayette. When Lafayette spoke in Tucson, he mentioned the beautiful mountains surrounding the city, and he echoed King's last speech, saying, "The mountaintop in Tucson is what King had in mind." His reference to the mountaintop reminded me of my drive down to Patagonia to visit Gary Nabhan the previous February. The road had wound along the eastern flank of the Santa Rita Mountains, not yet spoiled by the Rosemont Mine. Several Border Patrol vehicles passed by going in both directions. The checkpoint on the opposite side of the road heading north was manned by a dozen or more agents. Then the big new Border Patrol station at the Sonoita Crossroads came into view. US, Arizona, and Border Patrol flags flapped on 3 separate poles out front. Parked in the adjoining lot and surrounded by a razor wire topped fence were scores of brand new, bright white dog catcher type SUVs. I slowed to count them. There were at least 150. The sight was formidable, but as I looked south toward Mexico, the rows of vehicles were dwarfed by the Patagonia Mountains lining the horizon. The towering, jagged peaks put the enormity and futility of the Border Patrol's task into perspective. The goal of a peaceful border, a border where so much death and suffering no longer occurred, loomed as great and mysterious and eternal as the mountains themselves. They filled my field of vision, yet as I approached, seemed to recede into the sky as if containing a treasure forever out of reach. They were symbols of the peaceable kingdom, God's paradise, right here on earth between the United States and Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate
Sure.
that. And I'm going to
Yeah, we can
stop
leave.
our.
Can I just leave that last screen on of the while we talk, or no?
Whoop, yeah, let me pull it back up. Sorry.
Just the one of my cover, yeah.
There we go.
Okay. If anyone has
Well,
any questions or comments or discussion, I'd be happy to field them.
Any questions in the room? Nancy Song, 1 second.
Yes, I haven't heard very much conversation about the cartels, and it seems to me that some kind of control there would make a big difference in the movement of some of these people. And I'm wondering if you have any comments to make about that.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to do is the cartels are trafficking migrants and drugs. That's what they do. And if there were no demand in the United States for migrants and drugs, they would not be in business. So what I think we need to do is, we've talked about ending drug prohibition, and I would really like to talk about ending migrant prohibition too, as well, because what happens when things like drugs and migrants are criminalized, that means that criminals can take advantage of people who aren't necessarily criminals, like drug users and migrants. And we know from 100,000 overdose deaths in the United States that drug use and abuse is a big problem in the United States. And if the Mexican border were sealed tomorrow, all the meth cookers in Arkansas would be pleased. You know, I mean, these things are going to be supplied to the American people that are demanding them. And we've seen with the legalization of marijuana, I talk about this in the book, that with marijuana being legalized and production has moved into the legal realm, the cartels have cut way down on their marijuana supply because it's not needed. Now they've switched to fentanyl, this absolute garbage. You know, you take one drop of it and it'll kill you. And so obviously, yeah, but I really believe that this whole issue, we really need to reframe this whole issue of how we view not only drugs, but also the demand for migrant workers in the United States. The new census shows that we really don't have enough migrant workers, people who are able to work these jobs. And we're coming up with all kinds of mechanized ways to pick crops and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, shouldn't there be a way to vet these people to make sure that they are not criminals, and then they would have a place to live, a place to work? They could, everyone is saying the Democrats, that these will be Democratic voters, but not necessarily. A lot of them are very conservative politically. A lot of them would be Republicans if they were welcomed into these small communities, these rural agricultural communities across America. They're Christians, they're law and order. I mean, a lot of these people a lot of them are fleeing out and out terror, violence, inability to make a living. And then here in the United States, you know, there's this gauntlet that they have to get through, but presumably once you get into the United States, there's a job for you and that there's a life for you. So what I'm working on now as a writer and as a thinker, I'm interested in finding out what are the models that we could use for where in the United States are migrants being successfully integrated into agricultural communities, because frequently these people are agricultural workers. And and they're being welcomed and supported. And it seems to me that this endless arresting the same people over and over and over again and then shipping them back to their countries it's really, it's not good for us and it's not good for them. Because I think in the future, we are going to need their labor. So that's what I would like, as long as migration is illegal, as long as drugs are illegal, this kind of cartel activity is going to occur. And it's just basic supply and demand. And they have taken over Colombia. They've taken over a lot of countries that are too poor and weak, that don't have the rule of law. And the police and the government in these countries are also totally corrupted by the amount of illegal money that's there. So like alcohol, I'd like to see us move towards, the way we treat alcohol in terms of the way drugs and migration is treated. And the other issue is, of course, the guns. And this is a huge problem in the United States of people, we're just awash in guns, and clearly the wrong people are getting their hands on them. And I mean, this has been going on for many, many years. And so now there's a very, very large gun violence prevention movement in the United States, but it needs to be connected also with the ending the flow of guns to Mexico. And there are some people who are working on that too. So yes, the cartels, they're bad news, they're criminals, they're horrible, but you shoot one down, another 10 take their place. We really have to look at this, just reframe the whole issue of the illegality of drugs and migration, or we'll never get rid of them. And we'll never get rid of the corruption of the governments in those countries either.
We have a question from our remote audience, Saul Grossman, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes. What's the current Biden administration policy on immigration?
Well, who knows? I mean, it's basically the same thing has been happening under Democratic and Republican administrations for the last 30 years. We've decided that the way to deal with this is law enforcement. And, they're supposedly looking at stopping root causes and all these things, but the United States government is very closely connected to these very corrupt governments in these Central American countries. And we support them. And this has been going on for a long time. I've heard there's 15 families or whatever that run El Salvador or whatever. And they're not particularly interested in ending violence in their countries and developing their countries. So this is a very difficult long-term problem that I think the people of the United States are going to have to be leading our government towards. We want some sort of different policy. Now, the current policy is basically a continuation of the Trump administration policy, which is basically a continuation of Obama, which is basically a continuation of Bush, back to Clinton, that we are going to attempt to drive migrants out into the desert, make it so hard for them to get across that they will die trying. And that's the policy. And it's not really sustainable in the long term, but at the moment, that's the policy. And we will keep arresting people over and over and over again and sending them back to their country. And I'm thinking, if we could just take all the money that we're spending, sending people over and back over and over again, and do some actual investment in people's countries, maybe we could change this, or have a legal pathways for people to become members of agricultural communities in the United States. So Biden's current policy, I believe he's now reinstituted the Trump remain in Mexico policy. So, yeah. And we saw with the treatment of the Haitian migrants that it's very ad hoc. It's very arbitrary. It's very, oh no, here comes a whole bunch more people. And I'm thinking, well, didn't they know they were coming? I mean, why did we end up with this Border Patrol agent, swinging his reins and in a very, very ugly image? It was like something out of the slave patrols in the 19th century. And we're still doing basically the same policy.
Another question from Bruce Kaplan. Bruce, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yes, in this part of the country in the 80s and into the 90s, the sanctuary movement was very active. I haven't heard much of them recently, so I'm curious as if you have any information on the sanctuary movement.
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on it in my book, and I just talked about it a little bit in that it's still very, very much an issue. because, and it's now grown from conflicts between small individuals and churches and the federal government, between local government and the federal government. And it's very, in California, California became a sanctuary state a few years ago. However, like they passed some laws that ICE cannot arrest people in sensitive locations or something like that, or that landlords weren't allowed to turn people in. They attempted to, make the state a sanctuary, but people felt that actually made things worse because it emboldened ICE roving patrols. And there was a notorious incident in which a farm worker couple was chased by ICE, their car flipped, and they both died, and neither one of them were bad people at all. That the ICE was actually looking for the brother of the guy in the vehicle that they chased. And this was in California, in the San Joaquin Valley, a couple of years ago. So sanctuary is in Texas. They've passed a law that no local jurisdiction can become a sanctuary, but then some local jurisdictions said they were. So in California and Texas, basically there's local jurisdictions fighting against state authorities, or the state authority fighting against federal authorities. Texas, you have the governor saying he's going to be going around arresting undocumented people on his own. And the governor and the feds are saying, you can't do that. We are the ones who are in charge of immigration law. So sanctuary is still very controversial. And I think it's going to continue to be so, because this issue of whether local authorities should be enforcing immigration law is what it's come down to. And they don't want to do it because they think that it's in conflict with their mission of preventing crime. So once again, the criminalization of migration in general has led to this ongoing conflict over what local authorities are supposed to do in terms of sanctuary.
You have a question?
Yeah, a couple of comments. I work with a group called Friendship Bridge. I don't know if you're aware of them. They're out of Colorado in Denver. And they sponsor 20,000 Mayan women in Guatemala in microcredit. So they have businesses. They have small
Fantastic.
businesses. And I think
Great.
this whole issue, they've done this for like 20 years now.
Right.
And the whole thinking is, these people are not trying to cross
Right.
because they have a business and they can survive. They're not like rich
Right.
particularly, but they are actually doing fabulous work. And, but I also just saw a film, I don't know if you've seen it, called Soledad. It's just been done by a woman at the University of Arizona about a young girl, a teenager, who basically was in a little village across the border. She refused to, do what the cartels wanted, she and her brothers. So they gang raped her. She was like 14.
Yeah.
She went to our border for asylum. They handcuffed her and threw her in jail in our private prisons up here. I've forgotten the name.
Right.
She was there for like, I don't know, 2 years or something. Some women at the U of A and some lawyers that are kind of involved in this became involved in her case and got her out where she can seek asylum. I just think what's going on is a nightmare. And I am very concerned about what's going on with the cartels, because they're obviously just brutal to the people in their villages.
Yeah.
And I don't know the solution. I just think it's a horrible situation right now.
Right. Yeah, I'm really glad to hear about these projects, the microcredit project, and because this is or people to people things.
Right.
Because when yes, I'm sure that some migrants are bad people, but the vast majority are not. And yes, people need to be vetted. People need to be checked out. I'm the first to say that. We don't want what we're having now. What the situation now is, if you can get farther out up into the desert and cross, you could be anybody. So the situation now actually encourages crime. The situation now encourages people to risk their lives and to get into cahoots with criminals because they have no choice. So if we had a more expansive immigration system, but also a system where you're right, where people would have opportunities to stay in their own villages. A couple of years ago, there was a little boy who died in Border Patrol custody. This guy named Felipe Gonzalo, and all the reporters went down to his village. And this place looked like Shangri-La. I mean, it was up in the mountains with mist. And I'm like, if they could only stay in their own beautiful homes, you know? And I think that we will get past this as a nation and as a hemisphere. Because
Well, I heard there's a suit, the Mexican government has now sued the gun manufacturers in our country. I saw that in the paper last week, because our weapons are going down there contributing to this problem.
absolutely,
Yeah.
70% of the crimes committed in Mexico are committed with US weapons or something. That's very staggering, the amount of, there's basically no controls over what's flowing southbound across the border. And gun manufacturers depend on these sales to cartels. They've actually proven that, you know, very large percent of the guns that are sold in the United States are actually smuggled into Mexico. So yes, we must, and this needs to be connected to the gun violence prevention movement in the United States. Because I don't think that suit will be successful, but the idea is that we need to keep pushing this on many levels, both legally and legislatively, many other so people to raise awareness. Because, you know, like cigarettes or alcohol, these are harmful products and they need to be very controlled and regulated. So
We have a question from the audience. Joel Snyder, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
What are your thoughts about reinvigorating the seasonal or limited duration Bracero program, which regulated economic migrants and might decrease the backlog of sanctuary claimants?
yeah, I believe that we should have much greater access to agricultural worker visas. The problem with the current program, the H-2A visa, is that it's basically indentured servitude. You know, there's no pathway to citizenship if you have one of these visas. You have to go home and you can't bring your family. And if you try to leave your employer, you will be arrested. So these guest worker programs have historically been very much designed in favor of the agribusiness, you know, employers. So they've been pretty exploitative, and also they continue this dichotomy of documented, undocumented. And the undocumented workers believe that it's unfair competition, you know, because, you know, one person gets this guest worker visa and then there's 10 who are out in the desert still. So it would have to be a pretty broad program. The president of Mexico, AMLO, has proposed that you greatly increasing the number of agricultural worker visas. I think that's a good idea. Again, all these people can be vetted and checked. They should be given decent places to live. I mean, the issue with farm workers in America has been going on since Harvest of Shame in the 60s, or, you know, even before then, it's been a scandal, the treatment of farm workers in America, because during the Depression, they were all Okies, you know, the Grapes of Wrath, right? It was about the Okies, and a famous California journalist, Carrie McWilliams, wrote the first book about exploitation of farm workers at the same year that the Grapes of Wrath came out, called Factories in the Fields. So the problem with farm workers is they keep being undercut by this constant supply of undocumented labor that they can be paid less, and easily 60-70% of farm workers in the United States continue to be undocumented. So that's in our very wonderful, abundant food supply is largely dependent on the work of these people, of undocumented people. So I think we owe it to them and also to ourselves.
Have another participant, Wendy Weringer. I don't think she has a question per se, but she's up in upstate New York. And so Wendy, if you'd like to unmute yourself and share your thoughts.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yes, some years ago, I went on a church trip down to Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, and we were hosted by Frontera de Cristo. And I had never seen the border wall, actually. It was a scar on the land. It was an experience that has stayed with me. It was very deep. We did they have a prayer vigil there every week, Frontera de Cristo, which honors the people that have died in the desert in crossing, some identified, some not. We met some of the Samaritans who provide water in the desert. the problem just seems so intractable. And right now I'm reading The Death and Life of Ida Hernandez. I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
Hold on one second. We lost you for a second there.
Example, that woman's just talking about Douglas and Agua Prieta. I don't know, you may already know about this, but our church went down a couple of years ago to visit the same group. And there is a coffee company in Agua Prieta.
Yeah.
Do you know about?
Yeah, I actually describe it in the book. It's called Cafe Justo.
Yes, I'd forgotten
Just
that.
coffee.
I think that is an
And-
excellent example though of how that was I
Exactly.
think an American businessman who helped them. They had the idea for the company, but some guy who understood business actually helped them get the business model together. But the people in Mexico and Chiapas basically
Right,
put
right,
it together, and until COVID,
right.
they're doing great.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with that now, but that is a great example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. These were refugees. They'd been
Right.
deported, and the guys from Chiapas. And they wanted to put together a coffee cooperative, because coffee can be a very,
Just real quickly,
Sure.
the people in the audience couldn't hear because the microphone wasn't being used. So,
I think, isn't it on now?
yeah, but
Yeah.
they couldn't hear the question. So if you could just
okay.
repeat that and then.
Well, did we have to, did the woman who was talking, is she done? Is she?
She was cut off in the middle.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we'll see if we can get back to
Okay,
her.
okay.
But go ahead and.
Okay, so we were talking about Cafe Justo, the company in Agua Prieta, and you can probably speak to that, but they distribute that coffee to US churches and universities, and they have a pretty thriving business going on, actually.
It's a great
Yeah,
thing that I really admire, because it's like a model
it is.
of ways that, because it's a coffee cooperative, so everyone who works, there's like 5 or 6 different little family farms or something like that, or maybe more in Chiapas, and they all make sure that their workers are fed and their children are clothed and that there's water, so they're, that the money that is made from the coffee, is going to support sustainable.
So we
living
in
for the
Tucson can
workers.
buy that coffee. Yeah, these people, because you can buy it through various churches. I know the Unitarian Church here has coffee for sale, and they come to the 4th Street Fair. They're people they did before COVID. Anyway, I thought that was a great example of these people. Were very smart. They were very hardworking and smart and trying to make this happen for them.
Right.
So they could support their families and not give money to like a big middleman.
Right.
Normally, I don't understand all this myself, but normally in the coffee business is evidently like sort of a middleman that gets a whole lot of the profits, and they were eliminating that,
Right.
trying to market it themselves.
Right. Yeah. There's
Yeah.
a lot of work now in the fair trade. Because a lot of companies will just slap fair trade on their product and you don't know whether it is or not. But there is this place in California where they actually make sure that it is fair trade, because people do want to support. You pay the same price for the coffee, or a little bit more, but you know that the money is going to actually benefit the
Right.
workers and not, Folger's bottom line or whatever. So that's a great thing. The Frontera de Cristo and also the Cafe Justo, they have a little coffee shop there. So they in Agua Prieta, and that's where they send the beans up there and they're ground there in Agua Prieta. They're roasted and ground and then distributed nationally and internationally. Yes.
Is this on?
Yes, and apologies to those people in the audience. They're saying there's an echo, and I think one of our external microphones turned on when our speaker went off. So I apologize for that. But go ahead, Clara.
I think that what individuals are doing and have done is great, but I think the problem is greater. Is our government just so big that there is no way we can do anything on a government level like this? So that's one question, because it's very frustrating for our government not to be doing anything that seems to be substantial. But another thing, in the beginning of Trump, when he was separating families, I saw a couple of news stories on CNN where the media had gone into like El Salvador and focused on the country and how beautiful it was, how people wanted to stay in their own country, and how dangerous it was for them to do that. And I thought, wow, and then they quit doing it after a couple of shows on that, they quit doing it.
Right.
I think maybe they need to just blast us with the problem of why people are coming, not because they want to. And so I don't know, I think the media could play a part, but I cannot believe our government can't do better.
Yeah. Well, I think a big problem is the border's so far away from the centers of power in both Mexico and the United States. And it's more like a symbolic place than an actual, it's like this theater, this political theater that's being played out there. Because in Washington, and a lot of people here, believe that, they just want this problem to stop. They just want this problem to go away. They just want these people to not be shown, because it's very sad and it's very painful. And we don't really know what to do as a nation. We are stuck in this law enforcement response to what is essentially not a law enforcement problem. And it's the same thing with drug use and migration. These are phenomena that happen. And, we need control or knowledge as to who's doing what and who's taking what, but to criminalize every drug and every drug user, and to criminalize every migrant and every person who needs to migrate, it's going to end up with the situation that we have. So we have to sort of go back to the beginning and say, okay, we need a certain amount of law enforcement on the border. We definitely need, I'm talking about a different sort of a metaphor than open and closed, because what we've done is we've closed off the border, but the result has been tens of thousands of people dying out in the desert, and real exploitation and suffering in Mexico, where people are being forced to wait. So what I'd like to see is, and Washington, yeah, they're stuck in the same pattern of somehow thinking that if we could just seal the border, then this problem would be solved. Or if we could just build an entire wall along the border, then somehow the migrants would quit coming. But my point is that we've already sealed off as much as we can reasonably seal off, and it's resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people and great suffering. And a lot of these migrants are good, honorable, decent people who really do deserve to be treated better. And they could, there could be good people here in America too. So yeah, I'd like to, that's my hope for this book, so that we can get beyond the, law enforcement is going to solve this, because it's not going to. And you're not going to get any greater solution than you already have. You're not going to have any more law enforcement on the border. It's like Doug Ducey was down there yesterday saying, oh, these migrants are still coming across and it's the Biden administration's fault. And I'm like, well, where are they supposed to go? What are they supposed to do? I mean, if they all were forced to remain in Mexico, would that be okay with people? But I don't think it would be. And I don't think that,
I do blame Biden's administration, as I blamed all the other administrations prior to that.
Yeah.
Why don't they hire people who know what they're doing? They form so many coalitions of people that don't know what they're doing. So maybe you ought to send Biden your book.
I'm sort of new to Tucson, but the churches here, first of all, in terms of the whole sanctuary city thing, I spoke with one minister. He said they don't want to be a sanctuary city because then it draws the press.
right.
And they like to do things kind of at a low level.
Right.
They don't want a bunch of press in there stirring up news stories. They want to just be able to deal with things.
Right.
But the other thing, it seems to me some of the nonprofits like Friendship Bridge and like that microcredit idea, are doing some good things. And, you know, when Kamala Harris went down there, she was the Attorney General of California. Surely she is a little more aware of some of the realities of the situation.
Yeah.
I'm hoping.
Well, although she
Yeah.
is, I mean, she's basically.
Well, I'm not saying she's going to do anything right now, but anyway.
I mean, our current policy, and now we have Chief Magnus as the head of CPB, but I'm not anticipating any big changes in the policy. Because this is what we've agreed on as a nation is what we're going to do. We're going to be, rounding people up, and there's, a few people get in. So it's sort of like the borders like this. It used to operate like a sluice gate. When we needed workers, they just let them in, no questions asked. But in the last 20, 30 years, it's been very, very hard to cross the border without risking your life.
Maybe you
do it.
should send your book to Kamala too.
So I want to see if this will work, but I'm going to try to ask Wendy to come back on if you can, Wendy. Are you still there?
I am still here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry about that. We lost
No,
you.
that's okay. They're just comments, and a lot of the people have responded in kind. But I started to say that I'm reading The Death and Life of Ida Hernandez. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but she lived in Douglas and Agua Prieta and was undocumented. It's a horror story, and unless you hear these stories, you don't really grasp the horror of what's going on. So thank you for this talk.
Thank you. And thank you for your interest in your work.
Well, I think we're about on the hour here at
Okay.
2:30. And again, want to thank you so much, Miriam, for
Sure.
coming. It's so wild to have a real person here.
Thank
so-
you. Thank you so much. Thank you for your interest in these issues, and thank you for all you're doing to help people on the border.